I was teasing our next group of panelists that really all morning we've been talking about hydrogen, we've been talking about carbon capture, sort of, right? It's just been coming up. It's been coming up as part of broader conversations. Now we have fully landed in hydrogen carbon capture land. And we've got three great panelists to help us talk about this. John Paul Clark, Dr. John Paul Clark. He is the amazing professor that Senator Hutchinson was talking about last evening. Corby Robertson, who's a longtime friend and longtime oil and gas executive and energy executive, and he's now, I know him directly through the Carbon Neutral Coalition, which is all about let's stop talking and let's make carbon capture happen. And then Cynthia Walker, who's also I've known for a long time. I had the pleasure of working with her at Goldman. She's now the CEO of TESS America. She'll talk to you about what they're doing, which is very innovative and way out on the cutting edge of hydrogen. But the best part is, like any good college course, we're going to get to hear from the professor first. JP is going to walk us through a little bit of hydrogen just to set the stage. And then we'll hear from the others, and we'll get to ask some questions. So let me get a round of applause for these three.
I'm J.P. Clark, as Maynard said. I'm a professor here in aerospace engineering. And you might want to ask, why is an aerospace engineer speaking at an energy conference? And the real answer is, I like to solve tough problems. And so I'm going to talk today about decarbonizing aviation, which is a notoriously hard segment to decarbonize. And I'm going to talk about some fundamentals, because you're getting course credit for this, by the way. And also talk about a company that I co-founded about 3.5 years ago to actually create a fuel cell electric airplane, the world's largest. And so I've entitled my talk, Realistic Hydrogen-Based Solutions for Sustainable Aviation. Next slide, please. So I always like to talk about hydrogen, and everybody starts at saying, hydrogen is great. It's light, it's all these things, and it's the most abundant element in the universe, which gets everybody excited. But I always remind them that, unfortunately, on Earth, hydrogen is in lots of committed relationships. So it's in a committed relationship with oxygen, in water, and a lot of committed relationships with hydrides, et cetera, and different minerals. And like all good committed relationships, it takes a lot of energy to break them up. And so that's really the big challenge with hydrogen. Next slide, please. So there are various colors of hydrogen. I think, and by the way, the U is for the folks in the room who grew up in England. If any of you are here, just because they spell colors differently. I grew up in Jamaica, so we spelled it that way, so I like to put it in the slide. And so there are various levels of colors of hydrogen, as they are in most of the energy places. Green, of course, being the color that they're using, that has been used for the most sort of benign sort of hydrogen that's produced by wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, or tidal. And then, of course, there's nuclear, which does have some byproducts, but those byproducts we've seen and we've heard before earlier today can be relatively easily contained. And then we have yellow hydrogen, which is from mixed origin grid energy, and that has slightly more hydrocarbon or warming effects, footprint, and hydrocarbon footprint. And then once you get past those, most of those are used to produce hydrogen via electrolysis. And we'll talk a little bit about electrolysis in a sec. Remember, there's a test after this. And so the other colors, ranging from blue, going turquoise to gray to brown to hydrogen to black hydrogen, are successively closer you move from natural gas, which we just heard about, all the way to basically coal and coal-based gasification to produce the hydrogen. And those are successively, more impact in terms of the environment. So next slide, please. So, engineering is now part of the K. Bailey Hutchinson Energy Center. And so I wanted to give everybody a nightmare by reminding them about calculus. And this is a little bit of a calculus joke because, nuclear fuel has a high half-life, which is basically one of the reasons we worry about storage of the hydrogen. But as a limit, as the half-life tends to 0, pink, if you squint in it, turns to green. So in my view, nuclear and renewable produced hydrogen are pretty much green. So next slide, please. So as I was saying before, all the renewable sort of green hydrogen that goes through electrolysis starts with renewable energy. And we have heard about solar plants and solar production, and this is one in the Middle East where you can actually see a lot of concentration of solar power. The one that's probably the most reliable throughout the centuries has been hydro. I mean, costs a lot to put a hydro plant in place. Not many have been built, but they are a very, very reliable source of renewable energy. And of course, wind. And wind, like solar, has the issue that it varies over time. And so that's part of the thing that you need to manage that variability. And one of the things, most of my research portfolio is basically decision-making under uncertainty. And so I look at the whole problem of supplying energy is that you either not need to have a buffer with excess capacity to deal with places where you have capacity dropout and you can be replaced, or you need to have some way of storing the power when in the area when demand is low, so that you can then flatten out the whole distribution system. But in addition to that, and we've heard about that before, you also need to have a reliable and robust distribution system. And so we've talked a lot about running electrical lines and electrification, not only of vehicles, but of the whole supply chain. But growing up in Jamaica, I was always reminded of the great earthquake and great fire of Kingston in 1907, which is the same year as in San Francisco. And what happened was the fire started because there was an earthquake, and at that time in Kingston, they had built a lot of gas lines under the street. And those gas lines broke, and things weren't as sophisticated as they are now in gas distribution. And so there was a great fire that burnt down about 1/3 of Kingston. Since then, all the propane that we use for cooking in Jamaica is distributed in 100-pound cylinders. And so that was one of the things that I was sitting down at dinner 3.5 years ago in New York with my co-founders, and we said, how do we tackle the distribution problem? Because people talk about hydrogen, and you get figures like 16 trillion to build out a distribution network. And I hate to say it, but we don't have that kind of excess profits floating around the industry and any one person to actually say, I'm going to go and build that distribution network, like we did when we were building out the automobile and energy distribution network. So next slide, please. So, it would be nice if we could produce the hydrogen at a place where we have this power, the green power, or the pink power, and be able to distribute it not only by electric lines, but also another means which gives some robustness to the distribution system. And so the key then is, how do we tackle this electrolysis problem? You need lots of water, and you need lots of electricity. And this is not on the test. This is just an example of how the electrons flow, and you basically shock the water into separating, if you want to have a better word. So the next slide. The good news is that there's lots of them. First of all, there's lots of wind energy and lots of solar energy. And hydrogen was studied many years ago as a way of a storage technique for those off-peak demand series. Because if you go to the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State, in the middle of the night, they're offering you electricity at 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Problem is, in the middle of the night, you get nothing to do with it. So one idea is to produce the hydrogen there and then transport it, right, and get it to the places when you need it, where you need it, when you need it. And so there's also a lot of excess water. And the good thing about electrolysis and hydrogen and using hydrogen is that you're really not using the water, you're just borrowing it. So you break it up, use the hydrogen, and then you recreate the water. So it's a very sustainable process in and of itself. So there's lots of water, lots of renewable energy coming online. And next slide, please. Lots of capability that are basically driving up the efficiency of the electrolysis process. And you see that slide on the left, which talks about the capital expenditure that's occurring in that area. And there's also comparable efficiency gains. And then those efficiency gains are basically driving down the cost of hydrogen. And we have actually, and I'll tell you that, people willing to sell hydrogen in 2025, 2030 at some very, really good prices, green hydrogen. I don't know if you've seen the same. So next slide, please. So this all came together, like I said, in this restaurant called the Beatrice, in this hotel called the Beatrice Inn in New York. And we named the company Universal Hydrogen. You know, we thought about naming it Beatrice, but that would be hard to explain. So we called it Universal Hydrogen. And the business model that we came up with was basically creating the hydrogen at the source, which syncs with a lot of the conversation that we've had, put them in modules, which we have designed, transport them by the intermodal freight transportation system, and basically drop these modules into an airplane as if they're like batteries. Use them, retrieve them, recycle them, and just keep that system going. So that's the model that we've been using at Universal Hydrogen. And in addition to this supply chain and the module, which is innovations, we've also, next slide, innovated on the aircraft space. We've actually created the world's largest fuel cell electric aircraft. And it took flight last March, earlier this year in March, the 2nd of March, in Moses Lake in Washington State. It's a 2-megawatt powertrain where we basically, and we actually have a patent on the powertrain where we actually created a fuel cell electric powertrain that does not require batteries, which is a significant very difference for the Toyota Mirai, for example, which actually has a lot of batteries to deal with the surge power. So I'm a controls engineer, so I took on the challenge and we figured it out. And so now we actually have 270 airplane retrofits on order. We're building our tanks, and we're moving forward with other areas as well. And I'm using this not only to highlight the fact that we've been able to do something for aviation, but to highlight the fact that with this modular technology, we could actually supplement or complement the grid electrical power by actually distributing small electric generators powered by hydrogen. Because as we build out, as the demand for all these eVTOLs aircraft and all the electric cars grows, we're going to have a challenge in terms of timing to build out the grid. And so going back to discussion about robustness, I think that hydrogen is a nice complement to all the other things that we have. It's also a nice complement on the distribution side to basically getting us some robustness so that if our grid goes down, you can still have a way to distribute energy in the form of small electrical production units across the country, within a city, and also power aircraft, which for me as an aerospace guy is really what life's all about. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues.
No, thanks so much, JP. And there was so much in there, it's hard to move on, but we'll come back to everything that's happening in there. Well, you know, one of them is obviously the upfront. You're starting with hydrogen. In your case, you talked about renewables and nuclear. But Corby, one of your favorite expressions is, hey, if you like hydrogen, you need to like carbon capture, because right now that's how we make most of the hydrogen. Talk to us about the Carbon Neutral Coalition, everything you've been doing. You've been trying to get carbon capture codified into law, made practical, bring it into the marketplace. Just talk to us about all that.
Well, thank you, Maynard. Let me start by just overviewing the fact that CO2 injected into EORs is already a thriving and robust industry where they're piping CO2 thousands of miles, and they have 40 years of injection experience where they've been injected into tight formations to do sweeps to produce more oil. And so there is already, I think, a robust industry that's been created around CO2. All this is natural CO2 that's been produced and not anthropogenic that's been captured. But the next step of how do we capture it is technically very doable. As has been shown on other charts, the only 2 projects for CO2 that are commercially viable right now in the Petronova plant in Fort Bend County, Texas, Petronova used a Mitsubishi process to do the carbon capture, and that amine capture basically took 30% of the parasitic load. In other words, took 30% of the electricity that otherwise would be generated, to capture the carbon. I believe, as this is the start of something, on this handy-dandy thumb drive, I have noted 189 different carbon capture projects around the United States. Additionally, there have been 119 applications to the EPA for 45Q designation for Class 6 wells to inject the CO2 into different places. And so there is a budding industry waiting that will evolve. On the Carbon Neutral Coalition Advisory Board was Mike Belinkie, who started Entropy. Entropy has a carbon capture on a gas plant in Canada that's only got a 10% parasitic load, meaning they've reduced that energy cost by a third, down to a third of what it is for Petronova. I have read of others that are advancing various technologies that will be reducing that cost. And so to the extent that there goes forward with a viable industry, I believe at $85 a ton, with the right sort of circumstances, that this can become a viable industry right here in Texas. Texas is the #1 emitter of CO2 in the United States and maybe #7 in the world. And so if you want to solve the problem of carbon emissions, this is an important place to start. To do so is probably $1 trillion investment. That investment, if it's profitable at $85 a ton, which I believe that it can be, based upon advanced technology, based upon judicious work to reduce the cost. Most of the pipeline right-of-ways are there. The right to use them for carbon or CO2 has to be negotiated, but there are plenty of opportunity within this space, to create an industry. So the Carbon Neutral Coalition undertook in the last legislative session to advance 4 different bills that would then address the solution to how do you create an industry in Texas. The first thing that needs to happen is the Railroad Commission needs to get primacy, meaning that it have the right to designate, the 45Q $85 a ton tax benefit to the companies that are doing the carbon sequestration and capture. That $85 a ton right now is hung up in the EPA in that, frankly, the EPA has very little or no experience at managing underground reservoirs, whereas Texas has a tremendous, and the Railroad Commission has a tremendous experience based in injecting CO2 into EOR projects. You have either a very experienced regulator that would like that opportunity to regulate, or a very inexperienced one in the EPA that's based sitting on those applications. In the case of North Dakota, it took them 2 years to get primacy, but they've got it. It took about the same amount of time in Wyoming. We are about 2 years into the process with the Railroad Commission. What I've heard most recently is that they are syncing up, the Railroad Commission is, with the federal legislation so that our request for this designation of primacy would match up with their regs. In other words, I'm encouraged that this can go forward even in the Biden administration. I guess the second thing that needs to happen in the state of Texas is they need to determine who owns the pore space. And basically there is a bill that would say that the surface owner ought to own this pore space that unfortunately had unitization and the insurance all wrapped up in the same bill. And between the cattlemen and the Farm Bureau and the Texas Oil and Gas Association, and the Chemical Council and the Mineral Board, they didn't get it done. And so the thought that we have now is instead of having a carbon neutral coalition, we're going to create a reliable energy alliance, meaning the alliance between those parties that I've just named would come together and find common ground and handle these issues one at a time. The unitization issue in Texas, has been offered many times over a 30-year period and never got anywhere. So I would offer to you, though, It would be nice to have, and I certainly would support it. Indeed, at the Tom O'Connor Field, across the lease line with the O'Connor family's Copano oil, we tried to unitize some of the reservoirs, and over 30 years we're never able to do so. It's a difficult question and process to get that done in Texas, but so I think the next biennium, hopefully they will separate those issues and not make that some big requirement. The final thing that I would mention is a solution to how to actually create an industry here is have the state of Texas set up an insurance plan. And North Dakota has set one up. An insurance plan, you can charge a premium for them insuring the CO2 sequestration. And so the Railroad Commission, if it's regulating where the CO2 is going to be stored, would basically take on the responsibility of if it crosses the lease line, or if there is some leak, or if there's some other problem. In the 40 years of CO2 injection for EOR, there's been no cost, there's been no problem, but notwithstanding, you step back and you saw that ethanol is already capturing the CO2. And there's 130 ethanol plants that have signed up with the Navigate pipeline system up in Iowa, and the Sierra Club turned around and sued them to keep them from building the pipelines. And so they're stuck in court right now. And so within the Texas umbrella of how do you form an insurance plan and take responsibility for the regulations, there has to be some guard against nuisance lawsuits that basically are shutting them down, because environmentalists basically are trying to eliminate fossil fuels. Y'all have already seen that after several $1 trillion and 20 years of development for wind and solar around the world, they've dropped the world's dependence on fossil fuels from 85% to 82%, meaning that as a practical matter, we're going to be needing fossil fuels not only for electricity, but for all other aspects of your life forever. The question is, can we clean them up? CCS does that. Essentially, we can create a low carbon environment that is applicable to all economies around the world. And of course, there's 1.4 billion people in the earth that don't have power in the first place. And most of the other development around the world is coal-fired. There's, more coal got burned last year than any year in the history of the world. And it's coming out of China and India principally, but it's basically coal-fired all over the world. Germany went back to coal-fire. They tore down some windmills to crank up a lignite plant. So the long and short of it is, the U.S. can't do this by itself, but we can lead. And part of the leadership and technology development needs to be around carbon capture. And the sequestration part, because of EOR, there is a tremendous amount of experience that we can draw on, both from a comfort for the safety and from the regulation. One comment that I would make to you is that CO2 is a naturally occurring substance at 419 parts per million, and I'm breathing in 419 parts per million, I'm exhaling 40,000. It is something that's ubiquitous around the entire world. It's not going to hurt anybody. If you put H2S with it, it would be a problem. But CO2 by itself is not a terrible hazard to anybody, and there's been thousands of miles of pipeline that have been no problem. So the environmental concern about, oh my goodness, what's this going to do? Essentially, if it escaped, you'd be breathing it, just like you are now. So I would offer to you that there is a wonderful opportunity here in Texas to lead. And the technologies will get developed and the cost will come down, just as it has for wind and solar, just as it's projected for the other transition part of the economy. And so there's an opportunity set here that ought to be taken advantage of. One comment that I would offer to you on hydrogen, just to give a piece of information. When I first did this exploration, I called Chairman Toyota, who is the head of the Energy Advisory Committee for the country of Japan. And he got the Emperor's Award for putting together a blue ammonia production from Saudi Arabia that provides 10% of Japan's needs. And instead of doing hydrogen, which was going to cost 3 or 4 times as much to transport. They're using ammonia. So as you're thinking about the hydrogen economy, which already exists in Texas, the petrochemical industry has got a 1,000-mile pipeline, and there's already a robust hydrogen industry here. It doesn't just extend to hydrogen its own self. It extends to ammonia. It extends to methanol. I've had 2 different shipping companies, bulk shipping companies. The shipping industry is looking at methanol and ammonia principally as potential sources other than bunker fuel, which is the nastiest stuff they could find and buy. But those other sources are a potential source of energy that's low carbon. It's not no carbon, but they're certainly low carbon versus bunker fuel. So there will be other opportunities within the whole space of technology and how you break down these carbon atoms and use them to everyone, and hydrogen atoms, and use them to everyone's advantage.
That's great, Corby. I was realizing as you spoke, I did make a mistake in the introductions. I should have mentioned you're the only panelist amongst us who played for Darrell Royal. So I should probably just make sure you guys are all aware of that. There we go.
Well, Maynard, if you would like a Darrell Royalism, as I look at this list of 189 carbon capture, and there's only 2 that are commercially viable now, I'm reminded of Mike Campbell, my defensive coordinator's definition of potential. Potential is there's a lot of potential to carbon capture and sequestration, but it means you're not worth a shit now. Pardon me.
See, and you thought we wouldn't get that till later
That's
today.
a direct quote.
That's awesome. Well, and the other thing that's it's striking, and I know this from conversations with you. I'll put words in your mouth a little bit, but you see this as something that it's important to the oil and gas industry. It's important to the world's ability to use oil and gas. It's important to Texas as a place that has a ton of oil and gas, and so therefore it's something that is very much part of, as you think about the future of the state, it's something that you're passionate about and thinking about how you can think about your grandkids.
Maynard,
and the future.
let me tack on to that thought.
Okay.
There is certainly a huge regulatory environment that's created in the federal government, and there are lots of folks that would like to eliminate fossil fuels. The polling basically says there's 25% of the people that would like to eliminate fossil fuels. They haven't been to this conference and listened to these speakers. Okay, there's a lot of information that I think has been shared here that would tell you that what we need to do is clean them up. We don't need to eliminate them, but notwithstanding, there is a huge threat. The financial community, minus J.P. Morgan, has been very stressful. I do have coal interest too, and I've had all the big banks drop out of the coal lenders. Now, we've got a group of Texas banks, that have created a loan for us, but I won't even name the names that have dropped out, but the big banks have basically run from fossil fuels, and not all of them have. JP has not, but there's quite a few others that won't do business. Most of them have picked back up on oil and gas. I would say we've been through the deepest dip of ESG, but I don't think the whole idea of lending and investments is over. I bet you've seen some of the files or some of the slides that demonstrate that investment in fossil fuels is down dramatically, which means that in the future we're going to have higher prices.
Well, let's, Cynthia, we got to get you in here. Cynthia is the CEO of TES America, and as I think about all the things that we talk about in the future of energy and things that might change, E&G is something that is maybe less talked about. It's newer. It's fascinating. So would you mind talking a little bit about the company and what E&G is and kind of how you see it fitting in to where we are in this whole discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. How many have heard of E&G? Raise your hand. Okay, I see my 2 colleagues in the back. I see PJ, I see John. There may be a couple of others. And we're a relatively new company, but we've been at it for about 3 years, and we've been understanding this technology. And what you need to know is that it's actually not about technology. Everything we're doing is established technology. It's about execution. So our mission is to accelerate global decarbonization by being the largest producer of ENG. And we do that by first producing green hydrogen with electrolysis, and then we combine that with CO2 that someone else has captured. So we're very, very interested in ensuring that the market for CO2 becomes a reality. But when you think about the molecule that comes out of our process by putting those two things together, it's CH4, it's natural gas. It can be used in any piece of infrastructure and by any plant or consumer that uses natural gas today. So this singular little molecule, ENG, solves all kinds of problems. The problems you've heard about today around transmission, the problems you've heard around the backlog for renewable electricity, the problems you've heard around building infrastructure. We have massive natural gas infrastructure. So we're an unbelievable enabler for the hydrogen revolution. That's a way to think about what ENG is.
So maybe just, because I did this with you not too long ago over breakfast, it's just kind of fun to go from the beginning through to the end. But just so we're all clear, you're taking hydrogen that in all likelihood has come from renewables. Mm-hmm. You're taking that hydrogen, and then someone else, to your point, has captured the CO2, and you're combining that CO2 with the hydrogen. So you basically created a synthetic natural gas, but you didn't drill for it. You produced the hydrogen with renewables, et cetera. So now you're sitting on a, just a lower emission natural gas. You're sitting on a better version.
Yeah.
It's cost you more so far, but now you got a better version. And then you can take that and you can put it in to all the infrastructure we already have around natural gas. You don't have to worry about strange ways to transport it or strange ways to do whatever it is. So I just wanted to give it the layman's walkthrough there, because it's a fascinating thing that not many people have heard about.
Yeah, and maybe just to build on that illustration, you mentioned the carbon intensity, and I think this was covered in a number of the panels earlier today. When we look at the carbon intensity of what this molecule is, it's about a 90% reduction relative to the fossil alternative, because it does start with that renewable electricity. So it's a tremendous game changer in terms of carbon intensity. And actually, when you compare it with the other low carbon solutions today in the market for natural gas, everybody has probably heard about RNG, renewable natural gas. We look at the carbon reduction potential of that molecule is really somewhere like 30%, of course, depending on what its source is. So this is a way to actually accelerate decarbonization, but do it at scale. Any one of our plants can be, call it 30 times the size of production capacity that a typical RNG plant might be. So I like to say we're RNG but better, lower carbon intensity, and actually we can do it in a cost-effective way versus RNG today.
And this is all very new, right? So no one expects this to be, way down the cost curve yet. But just give us a rough sense of how ENG, what kind of costs you might encounter to make some ENG.
Yep. So
I know there'll be some assumptions, and you have
there'll be lots of assumptions, but this actually, to me, this is the most exciting aspect of this story. I think all of us, as a matter of fact, Maynard, when you and I first met back in 2003, so I was at Goldman Sachs, I was in New York, I moved down to Houston in 2003 and was part of the Global Natural Resources Group. And Maynard was one of the first people that I had the opportunity to work with, and he dragged me one day to a meeting, and one of the first meetings I had, and I learned about shale. This was then just the Barnett, as we were talking about earlier. And so that lived experience through the decades of the shale revolution is what gives me a lot of excitement and really confidence about what we can do with the cost of this molecule and other molecules like it. So ENG today, it really depends on what's the cost of your renewable electricity, what's the cost of your electrolyzer, these pieces of equipment that you're going to hear a lot about. That electrolyzer is about 60 to 70% of the cost, and these things today are produced in a very low-tech way. Most of them are actually assembled by hand. So when you think about the lack of supply chain, the absence of any advanced, robotic manufacturing, we are just at the very, very early days of what the cost of producing these molecules is going to be. But even given that, when you look at the cost of RNG today for a long-term buyer, let's say a natural gas utility that wants to decarbonize, we see the long-term cost of RNG at sort of $20 to $25 an MMBTU. There's a big range. There's some, high single digits. There's some 40s, 50s, 60s. We believe our ENG actually can compete at that level today and in certain places where we're developing. But over time, we believe these electrolyzer costs will be reduced in half easily. And we also expect that renewables are going to be significantly more abundant and cheaper than they are today. So all of these things are really going to contribute to acceleration of price. And when you look at the global markets for natural gas, which Toby touched on earlier, there's a premium market in Europe today just for pure fossil natural gas. There's a premium market in Asia. We believe we'll compete into those markets. And then over time, really, we want this to compete against fossil everywhere in the world.
So that last point is a really fascinating one, because I think everybody in the room, when you hear, like on your RNG comment, $20, $25 an MMBTU, you kind of compare it to a U.S. gas price and you say, oh, geez, But if you start comparing these types of numbers to what Europeans and Asians pay for gas price, you say, And one of your markets has been Japan. I think they've been pretty interested. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Japanese embrace, if you will, of ENG?
Yeah, absolutely. So as most folks here probably know, Japan has always been sort of short natural resources, so they've always been an importer of resources. They're probably the single largest importer of LNG in the world, but they too want to decarbonize. And the way they see that they can do that is through what they call e-methane, but it's the same thing as ENG. So we have been in conversations with essentially all of the major natural gas importers in Japan. We recently announced a partnership with Osaka. There are a number of others, but this is a massive market. They set a target. They want 90% of the natural gas that they import to be ENG. So there's a growing recognition that the market needs to be creative and find different types of solutions. So,
Dr. Clark, I've moved to Dr. Clark because we've got two JPs here today. We had JP Morgan, and now we got JP Clark. One thing that comes up around green hydrogen, maybe you can help us, Cynthia, jump in here, is that you hear that electrolyzers, the right way to do it is to be running 24/7 to generate that hydrogen. And so when you are making hydrogen with electrolyzers and using renewables, how do you get around the intermittency problem there?
Well, it's an optimization problem, like all of life.
Okay.
Right. So
Step to the board. We're going to right now.
Well, I'll refer back to the slide, with the ERCOT slide, for example, that showed wind, the wind versus solar production. as a function of time of day, right? So they're in many ways anti-correlated, some ways sometimes correlated. So if you think about, you have nuclear, which is steady, you have wind and solar, which most times are anti-correlated, but not, and you also have hydro. You can create a combination of those if you're in the right spot, and that's the key, right? Finding the spots to produce the green hydrogen so that you can get those resources, and you want wind and solar to be anti-correlated. When one is going up, the other one's going down. And you want to have that steady nuclear and hydro, basically, which gives you a nice base. And then you can control and optimize the amount of energy that you do, so you keep the electrolyzers running at a steady pace.
Is it, I think one thing Michael Semblis was saying is that when you make hydrogen, you just use a lot of electricity.
Yes.
Now, the reason why making it with renewables makes so much sense is because that might have been energy you didn't even use anyway.
Exactly.
So it does feel like, what do you think the trade-off is between trying to be completely dependent and have it be completely green versus it being, well, it was a few flavors that ran the electrolyzer that made the hydrogen? How do you think about that trade-off?
Well, for me, I mean, I think ideally, there's always an ultimate goal. And for me, the ultimate goal is pink or green, right?
I thought you were going to say the ultimate goal is an airplane because you're an aerospace guy.
Yeah, but the rocket folks get upset when you talk about airplanes only. So, but there's a transition, right? And you always have to figure out how do you make that transition to keep the robustness. I mean, that's an important thing. Robustness, I mean, in production, robustness in distribution. And one of the things that I think is sort of, I guess, the elephant in the room is how do we think holistically about the challenge? And I think that's one of the cool things about the K. Bill Hutchinson Energy Center is that we have a group of people who are thinking holistically about the problem and thinking about how we make that transition over time, managing that robustness in production and supply and energy security as well.
And can I just add on that, Maynard? So this is really fascinating and is a super new experience for me in my career. The definition of our product is actually determined by policy. Definition is determined by policy. So what Maynard is somewhat alluding to, in addition to the operational question of how do you put these pieces of technology blocks together, it's how is policy defining what is green? And today there's only one place in the world that has actually said what is green hydrogen, and that's Europe with the European Commission. And there are debates about, is there a direct connection from the clean source of power, the renewable power, the hydro, to your electrolyzer plant? Or there are questions about, are you taking your power, if you're directly connected to the grid, are you taking power from a grid that is clean, 90% or better green? Or if you're not doing either of those first two things, the third thing is when you're taking power off the grid and you may be buying renewable electricity from somewhere else directly from a power plant, where is that power plant located? And then, by the way, are you doing all of that with actually new sources of power that came on when you brought your plant? And this is unbelievably complex. And what I believe, Europe took a very strict view about what is green, and that makes it difficult. We have to be pragmatic if we want solutions to get started. I think exactly what you were alluding to there. Let's get started with things, and we're going to get better. We'll get purer. But if we try to say, well, we can only do what is the 100% green thing today, direct connect of green electricity to an electrolyzer, we're not going to have very many of these. So, what I think the U.S. will do is to be determined, but it is, we believe, not too far down the road. Hopefully, the end of November, they'll share what their definition for the 45V credits is. And we think it's going to be a more pragmatic solution for sure. There's been lots of debate, there's been lots of letters passed, there's been lots of consternation, but I'm fairly confident that our regulators or policymakers or implementers have heard a lot of feedback from Europe. I'll just give you one example. I was speaking with a developer in Finland, and they said, there's this time matching element if you're not directly connected. Is your electrolyzer producing in the exact span of time, let's say hour, that your renewable electricity is producing? And can you verify that across the grid? Well, in Finland, when it gets cold, they have wonderful wind power. It's very reasonably priced for European power, but there are long swaths during the year, 10 to 15 days, where there just aren't renewable, there isn't renewable power being generated. So they had to illustrate to the European Union, are we going to shut down our electrolyzer plant for 15 days, multiple times a year? It's just not practical, and the cost of hydrogen will be way too high, and the EU won't achieve their ambitions. So I think the US will be pragmatic. It may not be quite as flexible as it is today in terms of how you define renewable energy credits. But I think with respect to additionality and time matching and grid connections, I hope it's going to be more reasonable.
But you've hit on a big point here, which is we can do the IRA and we can talk about all these things, but there are people behind closed doors now saying, okay, what exactly are the rules? Mm-hmm. And that hasn't happened yet, and how that happens could determine so much of everything we're discussing. JP, you had something.
Yeah, and I wanted to sort of expand a little bit on the systems look of things, right? So, Corbin talked about the fact that you could transport the hydrogen by ammonia, because you can then put it in a liquid tank and you can move it around, or put it in a pipeline. When we were doing the airplane, we not only had to think about where to produce it and the transportation, we also thought about how it gets in the airplane. And burning ammonia we looked at ammonia, but burning ammonia in a jet engine is not a pretty sight by any measure, right? So all of these things has to be a systematic look. Production, transportation, and the consumption. And that is actually domain specific. And so for the aviation world, that was a solution. That might not be the solution. In other worlds, it may be to put the hydrogen in ammonia. Mm-hmm. In another world, it may be to put in ENG. But you have to do that within the context that we're trying to push everything as close to green as possible as an economically feasible pace as possible. But in the end, that's the key.
One thing.
I might make a point.
Get in here, Corby.
We're all searching for how do we lower the carbon. In a low carbon environment, there's always going to be some that is going to escape. And I want to put in an advertisement which we haven't heard from Mother Nature. She's essentially absorbing 752 gigatons right now without our help. And to the extent that you have best practices for land, for sea, for forest, there is a way to augment how much sequestration nature is doing, and then within the offset market get paid for it. We did, at the last legislative session, help the Baker Institute and Blue Carbon pass an initiative that allows the Parks and Wildlife to participate along the Texas shore in blue carbon projects, meaning make oyster beds, which absorb carbon, mangrove forest to absorb carbon. The forest naturally do it. NRP, who I'm chief executive of, has done a carbon offset trade that in the California compliance market that Chevron bought and continues to buy these both, reduction credits and storage credits or avoidance credits. And so there is a robust market in a voluntary offset market that can grow and absorb and help nature absorb additional carbon that basically, to the extent that RNG has some amount of leakage or your hydrogen's got some more leakage, there's something else that's going on here that's been going on since the beginning of time that we can add to. And so the offset market is something that's important. Texas passed something in the legislature this last session, and B Carbon at Baker Institute, I think, is doing a wonderful job of advancing reduction where they're reducing the amount of emissions, type credits.
So Corby, I'm so glad you brought this up because this is the old-fashioned carbon capture, and this came up a little bit with Toby. What would you tell us? It seems like nature-based solutions to capture carbon. It seems like there's been an evolution. At first, people were a little cynical about it, like really a tree is going to solve this, but now they're realizing, wait a minute, this is low cost. This actually helps, and you can create some some trading credits around it, and also, it's who doesn't want to plant more trees and do things that help nature?
Well,
the
Forest Service has been studying how much carbon is absorbed in forest, all across the whole United States for 20, 30 years, and so there is a big database on which you could make some pretty serious assumptions and assertions, and doing the technical work around what is the volume of timber, within the specific area, and what is the growth rate, and depending upon the age of the forest, there's plenty of technical information on which you can make judgments. And it took us 2 years to go through the compliance part of the California market, and so it was very thoroughly investigated and presented and then absorbed. So on the average, the Appalachian forest that I have, for the most part, absorb 2.9 tons of carbon per acre per year. And so there is a base of knowledge on that. The soil carbons that Baker Institute and B Carbon are trying to do have a lot less information, but the King Ranch has been sampled in 4 places, and they're sampling. I think Exxon has participated in trying to give them some money to sample other places in Texas. We're doing sampling right now in Montana and West Virginia. So that the soil-based and how much is absorbed by that is just beginning to evolve. The blue carbon is just beginning to evolve. So there's a lot more to learn about it, but notwithstanding, it is pretty well known how much is absorbed. And I think, frankly, the ocean is the biggest potential sink. And very little has been done. They're growing seaweed and things like that do absorb a lot of carbon. And there's something interesting, just as a sidebar, Susan Combs, who is a wonderful West Texas rancher and has been solved in both state and federal government, basically has been investigated. And if you feed seaweed to cows, they burp less methane. This is a small factoid.
Maynard, can I add on that? So the full name of TESS is actually Tree Energy Solutions. It's quite long and it doesn't roll off the tongue, so we go by TESS. But what's important about that name is actually fundamental to what we do, but it is exactly your point that we live on a carbon cycle. That's how nature exists. And so our company and others that do similar things, maybe have different derivative products, the reason we exist is to recycle CO2. And I just want to put a plug in for my colleague in the back. If anyone has been driving around Houston and you see a license plate that says CO2 45Q, that's one of the team members at TESS. So in addition to doing all the great nature-based solutions, if we recognize that CO2 has value and we find ways to reuse it and create molecules that our energy systems can already utilize, it's a tremendous advantage.
I was going to, JP, you said something in the beginning that probably caught all of our ears, which is you said you had orders for 200 plus planes. And I think people are used to seeing a lot of really cool stuff, but they're not used to hearing there's orders, like this is going to happen. Tell us about who's placing the orders, when this can happen, just some of the, as you guys implement.
So we have airlines from all over the world. as far away as New Zealand, in Alaska, a company up there in Europe. And we also, I mean, we've had investors who actually don't fly turboprops. So JetBlue Ventures is an investor, American Airlines is an investor. And so, you know, what the key thing is that for these turboprops that we're actually, first of all, we're retrofitting the existing ones, because getting that airplane certified, as you can imagine, is a painful process. And so we're very pragmatic in the way we went about this, in that we actually decided to retrofit existing ATR and Dash 8 turboprops. In fact, our G1 paper, which is certification basis, was just issued a couple of months ago. There was a press release about that a couple of days ago. And so the airlines recognize this is a great way for them to breathe new life into existing airplanes, because they'll be coming to get basically engine overhauls, and we're basically creating an economic solution that would have them replace their existing turboprop engines with fuel cell electric engines.
Do you mind just giving us the literal mechanics of, like, so you have a plane, it's got 2 engines, it's got a fuel tank, and then you're going to come in and put in electric engines, a fuel cell, and a hydrogen tank?
Yes.
Like
So you know, an airplane usually has the fuel in the wing. Unfortunately, for a gaseous thing, the wing shape is not the best thing for that. So what we're doing is we actually have put a fuel cell, which is, by the way, is the same thing as the electrolyzer, just running the opposite direction. And that fuel cell takes in hydrogen, takes in oxygen, and then creates water and electricity. And so you have to build a compressor, but aero people know how to build compressors. And so you put all of that in the nacelle out on the wing. So the fuel cell, the compressor for the air, and the motors, electric motors, are all in the nacelle. And for us, we actually put the hydrogen in the back of the airplane. And we take away some seats, but it turns out that the operating cost and the maintenance cost of a fuel cell motor system is actually less than a turboprop.
And from a performance standpoint, if you're the airline, so now you have a zero emission vehicle.
Exactly.
How does the performance of the vehicle compare to a gasoline
Well, it turns out that it's actually
jet fuel plane?
If you do the control system right, it's actually faster. It's like an electric car compared to a regular car. So we have actually fast acceleration, and the per seat mile cost.
Am I going to get there faster, JP? Is that what you're
Well, the top cruise speed is not fast, but you're going to take off fast and climb better.
Okay.
So that's going to be good. Less vibrations, so a lot of turboprop vibration, lots of it goes away. And then the most important thing is that even though we had to take out a few seats to fit the hydrogen modules in, the per seat mile cost is actually less. And because the production cost of hydrogen is more steady than the production cost of kerosene, it's actually a much more stable base for you to run your airline.
And these modules, anything you tell us, it sounds like almost like a propane tank type thing.
Yeah, well, it's actually it's shaped to fit the fuselage. So I should have probably put a picture in there. So you basically raise it up to the airplane on the existing sort of scissor lift that they put like cargo in the airplane. You slide it in the door, strap it, bolt it down like you do cargo, connect it, shut the door. And it actually makes the turnaround process even quicker.
Well, look, as we wrap up, Cynthia, maybe one question for you. Tell us about your travels. Like you mentioned Finland. We talked about Japan. I mean, this is a global thing. Anything you would share with the audience about your travels, your experiences, who's doing what, saying what, how it feels in certain places? Just give us sort of a sense of the globe, since you're all over it lately.
What I would say is, we're about a year into the IRA, and I think the IRA set off a massive global catalyst around climate. And there's a huge climate race on who can out-subsidize who, to build up production, but also build up lots of demand. And it's all across developing economies. And I think we might look back and say one of the brilliant things about the IRA was the massive investment in the USA, because we're trying to bring all these supply chains and manufacturing capability here. It's going to be a tremendous benefit for the United States. So I see a lot of interest in folks wanting to invest in the US. We announced our first project back in May with Total Energies, really one of the flagship IOCs in Europe out of France, for those that don't know them. We see a lot of interest in the Middle East to also invest here in the USA. There's been a lot of press about that. But there's also tremendous interest in countries all across the globe bringing clean molecule production to their countries. So we're focused in North America and Canada and the US. We're focused in the MENA regions, Middle East, North Africa, and we're focused in Australia. And it's a tremendous race, and it's just really exciting to be a part of. I think back to when the shale revolution began. That's what this feels like. I loved those stories that Tim was talking about earlier, you know, a few wildcatters looking at, you know, land and logs and well performance on one or two. That's what this feels like right now. It's really super fun, super complex, but really exciting.
So we're transitioning into the national security panel as our last panel. Corby, a last thought from you around as we move to national security. What strikes you? I know you think as a business person about supply chains and the country and the future. 30 seconds from you before we go to the last panel.
The 30 seconds are, we get 50% of our nuclear uranium from Russia. It didn't work out very well for Germany for 40% of their natural gas. As you look at, as has been said, the wind and solar, you know, are basically, for the most part, and the batteries are all sourced from materials from above. The University of Houston did a study for me that projected what would be required for us to be 100% electric cars by 2040 or 2050. It would require 83 times. I'll say that again, 83 times more of the materials to make them, the cobalt, the rare earth, the copper, you know, the lithium, the other things. It's not a very practical thought to think that the earth can provide that, much less what as a domestic thing can we do here. The fossil fuels, if we can clean them up, we're energy independent. I mean, we have the oil, the gas, and the coal here. All we got to do is clean them up.
Awesome. Get a round of applause for our panelists.